In the 3rd year of the reign of Joachim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Joachim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God, lowercase g. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So, Ashpenaz, the chief of the court officials, he was asked to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites, because the Israelites were in exile in Babylon and for 70 years. For 70 years. This was a judgment that was issued on the Israelites for disobeying God, and it was prophesied that they would be in exile in Babylon for 70 years. So, ironically, the king of Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar, insisted that these Israelites, these were the elite Israelites. They were of the royal family and of nobility. So they took royal Israelites and noble persons into captivity. That is, the Babylonians did. And instead of them to just enslave them and leave it at that, they were ordered into the king's service. Now, at that time, if you're ordered into the king's service, most likely they would make sure that you cannot function fully as a man, because they would turn you into a eunuch in order to make sure that you would not mix or breed within the confines of the king's palace. So in other words, if the king had either offspring, or he had concubines, or he had wives, or he had sisters, the people that were in captivity, which were the Israelites, if they were to come into the king's service, they wouldn't be able to impregnate or breed with them. That was why they would turn them into eunuchs. If you don't know what that means, it means to make sure that they don't have the function of their balls. So they would snip, yes, so that they would not be able to impregnate anyone. Yeah, painful and to think about it. But that was the order of conquering. And during that time, in those days, when the Romans, the Greeks, Babylonians, the Egyptians, it was about conquering. And so they would take whoever they conquer into captivity. And in that space of captivity, you're a slave. And when you're a slave, you can't just have your freedom. You can't do what you want to do. You can't impregnate who you want to impregnate. So this is why we should always be careful as a people to not anger the Lord their God. Because from what I've noticed in patterns biblically, whenever a people anger the Lord, he sends them in captivity to humble them. Yes. The Lord is known for sending people into captivity. When he gives them regulations, he gives them laws, he gives them statutes in which they're supposed to abide by, and they do not follow those laws, and they become prideful and they become puffed up, They become disobedient. They worship other gods. And you know God hates when people worship other gods. He hates it. It's part of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. So whenever a kingdom or a people or a nation were taken into captivity, if they had some form of reverence for them, even though they were enslaved, they would still bring them into the king's service. And these were nobility and royalty that were in exile in Babylon. And so naturally, they were not able to function fully in freedom and be able to impregnate or do as they would as if they were at home in Israel. So that is the first reason that they will cause them to not be able to procreate. The second reason is because of revenge. If you enslave a nation and you enslave a people and they begin to reproduce, that means their children can come back and avenge them. Their children can come back and avenge them. So you have to understand that the safest place to be is outside of the wrath of God. The safest place to be is outside of the wrath of God. Because once you have entered into the space in which God is angry, or he has wrath, or he has released a judgment on a people, and they go into enslavement, even if you're not locked up in a prison, your life really doesn't belong to you anymore at that point. You now have to serve another people. And so royal families and nobility had no business being in Babylon, serving a people that did not serve the same God as them. Nebuchadnezzar did not know the God of Israel. So they were now enslaved to a pagan people. Yes. They were enslaved to a pagan people and subjected to the rule and the laws and regulations of a pagan people. Why? Because they did not obey the Lord their God previously. So since they were disobedient and out of alignment with the God of Israel, there was a judgment released over them in the heavens, and then they were subjugated to a pagan people because they were behaving like pagans previously anyway. Lord have mercy, Jesus. This is just the beginning. We're in Daniel 1. So then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were from Judah. That's the tribe of Judah. One of the 12 sons of Jacob, or formerly Jacob, but then God called him Israel, and that's why the nation of Israel was birthed. And the tribes came from the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel. Jacob and Israel is the same person. So that's how the 12 tribes of Israel came about, from one man, formerly called Jacob, but then God changed his name to Israel. One of his sons was named Judah. Judah. And among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So look, now these foreigners not only are they training them in their language, right? They officially can't produce anymore. So they can't leave behind a legacy or a lineage. They are the last of their kind, right? So not only that, they're changing their names. When people start to change your name, it shows that you're in submission to the person, whoever changes your name, because you now become that which the person calls you. So if the person decides to call you a name spiritually, let's just say the name means mouse or rat. Spiritually now, you're being labeled something that you probably would have never wanted to be labeled as. Not to say that these were what the names meant, but this is why it's important to humble yourself before the Lord, because God will subjugate you to men. And then when he subjugates you to men and you're in service to men, you will wish that you had remained in a posture of humility so that you could be in freedom. But in that freedom, you will be in service to God. So now, they are being, their names, their beautiful Hebrew names are now being changed to Babylonian names. And so instead of calling them the names that their fathers and their mothers gave them, these Babylonians are now playing with their psyche and calling them Babylonian names. The chief official gave them new names. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, "Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. 10 days. 10 is the number of completion. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink." Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Okay, so I'm having a revelation now. Daniel made this request not on his own. He made this request because the Lord asked him to make this request. I'll say that again. Daniel was a prophet. Daniel was someone that used to receive instruction from the Lord. So the Lord gave him this instruction because they were entering into a new season. And they were now being called into the king's service. That means they had to be in a new location. They needed to be in a new environment. They were subject to new rules and regulations and expectations and obligations. And so the Lord wanted to fortify them. It was the Lord that wanted, it was God that wanted to fortify Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. It was God that wanted them to be fortified, because the king was the one requesting for them to come, but it was God that put them on the heart. God is the one that placed these particular young men on the king of Babylon's heart. He thought he was making the request on his own accord, but it was God that placed this request on the heart of the king. Why? Because God likes for his people to go into go into places so that his presence can be made known in that place. Daniel was the Lord's battle axe. What does it mean to be a battle axe? He was the judge. He was a judge. He is someone that God used as an altar, so that God, the Spirit of God, could show up in the location that Daniel was in. And then Daniel would be used by the Lord as a vessel, an earthen vessel, so that he can make some things happen in the midst of his people. So even though God had left them over to captivity, he still had covenant. He still had a covenant with certain people, with the people of Israel generally. But there are people that have been called, but there have been people that have been chosen. Daniel was a chosen vessel of God that God would use to make sure he looks after his people, even though they are in exile. Even though he's teaching them a lesson, he's still with them. So the 10 days was not Daniel's request, it was God's request. And then the request for the best of the noble Israelites to come into the king's service, that request by King Nebuchadnezzar was not from Nebuchadnezzar. It was the Lord that touched his heart to make him make that request, because God was orchestrating something. And he wanted to orchestrate a move in Babylon. Because remember, he was not the God of the land. The Babylonians, they worshipped other gods. They did not believe in the God of Israel. And God is always looking for what territory to take over, what territory to take dominion over. So he's always using his battle axes to do that. He's using his battle axes to do that. So he needed someone to go and be in the location close to the king. Closest to the head of the power of whoever their gods were. So that those gods could be judged. And he needed a battle axe to be in location. He needed his battle axes to be in location so he could judge the gods of that land. And it was Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah that were chosen vessels, so that the Lord could judge the land and judge the gods of Babylon. Okay? So this was the beginning of God's plan. When he said we cannot defile ourselves with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission, that was the move of the Lord, saying, okay, I'm going to fortify you for 10 days because I'm sending you into the king's orbit so that I can carry out my plan to judge the gods of their land. So he put his people into captivity, but still he walked with them. And then he now was planning to use this as an opportunity to humble the people who did not serve him. That is the Babylonians. Even though they looked like they were the head, they looked like they were in control. No one is in control of anything but God. I'll say this again. Never look at your circumstances and think that you're losing. Never look at your circumstances and think that you're winning, because it is all an illusion. Romans 9, I believe 16 through 18. If you read it, it says God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy. He has compassion on whom he wants to have compassion. It is not determined by our human efforts, but it is determined by God's sovereign choice, or by God's grace. Everything is by God's grace. That's why you should not be deceived by what your eyes see, because spiritual things are always taking place that are not seen to the naked eye. God is always facilitating something in the spirit realm. And if you were to look around you and be convinced that what you see is actually what things are, then you will be deceiving yourself constantly. That's why it's important to give God thanks in all that you do. Because it says, I will work out things for your good. If God is working out things for your good, even though you might be homeless, even though you might have just lost your job, even though you might be in prison, you can't take those circumstances that you're physically in and use it as a way to judge where God is taking you to. You can't. Because he's a masterful planner, and he uses his infinite wisdom to bring us from one location into the place that he has promised us. And he does it right under our nose, without us understanding or without us knowing exactly what he's planning. So that's why you just give God thanks no matter the circumstance that you're in. Because his aim is to put you in a better situation so that you will know that he is God. He's just not going to do it the way that you think he should do it. So 10 days, the fortification, that is what God wanted. He wanted them to be fortified. There was a fortification process that he wanted to take place before he sent them into the king's service. So he spiritually fortified them. He spiritually fortified him. And if he was about to go up against a land, if he was about to go up against a culture, if he was about to go up against a people, and he had to separate his earthen vessels of choice, he had to separate them, mind, body, and spirit, why would he allow them to partake in the food of that land? He would not allow them to partake in the food of that land because he has separated them. They are anointed. Anointed means to be set apart. So he anointed them for this service because he had a long-term plan. He had a game plan, and he wanted to use his battle axes to judge the gods of that land. So he set them apart and did not allow them to partake in the cultures and the customs and the things that everybody in Babylon was doing. Whenever God is going to use you, he will set you apart and he will fortify you for the plan that he has. There's an agenda that he has. He will set you apart to make sure you're not like the people whom he's going to send you in to be in the midst of. He's going to make sure you're not like them. So he has to put you through a process of fortification. And that was what God placed on the heart of Daniel, to make that request. So because God placed it on his heart, God had already went ahead of him to make sure that they would agree to his request, because it is the Lord that touches the hearts of men. He's the one that touches the hearts of men. Now, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. This is Daniel 1:15. At the end of the 10 days, it says Daniel 1:15, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And then it says in Daniel 1:16, so the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables and said. So now, what does that mean? They can continue their fortification process. It was the glory of the Lord that was released on Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael. It was the glory of the Lord that was released on them. And who can withstand the glory of the Lord? No one can. So once the glory of the Lord was released on them, Everybody around them was in submission to them, even though they were quote unquote slaves in the service of the king. The glory of the Lord was upon them. They were set apart. And so the Lord was moving on their behalf, and the Lord was showing up in their lives. You can't see the glory of the Lord and not be overcome by it. The power of the Lord was now in control of Babylon. Yes, because God had earthen vessels to have his way with. So he was showing up in the young men. And he started to navigate and control circumstances within the king's service and within the king's palace, even though he was not welcome there because they were serving other gods. So he came through his people. He came through his people. And he began to change things. And it says in Daniel 1:17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. So God had fortified Daniel, and he had given him the understanding of visions and dreams of all kinds. This is a foreshadowing. In other words, this was what God was going to use to enter into a land that did not believe in the God of Israel. He was going to use these capabilities to enter in. Study the patterns and the ways of God and how he moves. He's the Ancient of Days, and he never changes. God is always looking for earthen vessels. So, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Hallelujah. So the Lord had fortified them, set them apart, gave them understanding, gave them knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and also understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And then Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. These were all tools that the Lord released as a foreshadowing, because this is what would give Daniel that staying power. It would set him apart and make him special in the whole kingdom. Even though he was from Israel and he was exiled and under captivity in the land, his skill set that the Lord released to him during the process of fortification and obedience, because in order for him to be fortified and receive those spiritual gifts, he had to obey God's instruction. If God said, I don't want you eating the king's food, I want you to eat vegetables, that is obedience for him to listen to the Lord. And then through that obedience, the Lord will release those gifts to Daniel.